This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBarry. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
Well, good morning. It's good to see you in Sunday school. If you want to go ahead and turn over to the book of Judges, this morning we're going to begin chapter number 2 in the book. Just to do a little bit of reviewing, in chapter number 1, we first of all were introduced to the book of Judges, and the basis of God's command to Israel is that they were to drive out the inhabitants of the land. As they go into the land, cross the Jordan into the promised land, God had commanded them to drive out the inhabitants. And if the people wouldn't go, they were just to kill them. Men, women, and children, all of them. You say it seems awfully harsh that God would command them to kill everyone, including the little ones, but it's because of the sinfulness and the idolatry of these people that were living there in the land already. And so God said, completely remove them from the land one way or the other. And of course, as long as Joshua was alive, they were beginning the process of doing that, and they were following the leadership of Joshua, who was a very godly man. But after the passing of Joshua, then there was no one man who was the leader of Israel. You had 12 tribes that were supposed to possess the land, but no one man who was the head over all the tribes, as Moses and then Joshua had been. And so the children of Israel turned to the tribe of Judah. Now, if you'll remember, of the 12 sons of Israel, Judah was not the eldest son. Does anyone remember who the oldest son of Israel was? The one who should have become the patriarch of Israel, or the leader of the family after Israel. Who was the oldest son of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel? Anybody remember? It was Reuben. And Reuben is the one that should have been the foremost tribe of Israel. But we remember that in the story of the life of Jacob and his sons, when Jacob passed away, Reuben was not in line to become the patriarch, to receive the special blessing from God as the eldest, because he had sinned against his father. And so God removed him from being the first in line. Then there were two of Judah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, that were sons number 2 and 3. They were next in line to become the heir, or the patriarch of the family, who would receive the birthright. But both of them had sinned against God also. They had gone in and killed all the men in an entire city because of what one of the men had done to their sister Dinah. So as a result, God had removed Simeon and Levi, and that left Judah, who was the number 4 son of Jacob. Judah is the son who inherited the birthright. And so that's the reason that of the 12 sons of Jacob, it is through the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Reuben, that the Messiah will come. And so the tribe that would be the kingly tribe through which the Messiah would come would be the tribe of Judah. Judah was a very dominant tribe, even as the children of Israel first went in to possess the land. And Judah, the tribe of Judah, took up the mantle of Joshua's leadership, and the tribe of Judah led the way in clearing the land of the Canaanites who were there in the land already. And for the most part, the tribe of Judah did what God said to do. They, along with the tribe of Simeon, who had land within their possession of Judah, together those two tribes worked to remove many of the Canaanites in the southern part of the land. Then we read throughout the rest of the chapter 1 last week, we saw how tribe after tribe of the other tribes were not so successful in rooting out the Canaanites. So the remaining 10 tribes, for the most part, did not remove the Canaanites from the land. Some of them they removed, but most of them they did not. When they were stronger than the Canaanites, they put them to tribute, that is, put taxes upon them and made them serve the Israelites, but they didn't get rid of them. And that failure to obey God and not drive the inhabitants out of the land is going to plague Israel for the entire rest of the Old Testament period because of their presence in the land and them dragging Israel down into sin and idolatry. In fact, I think we could perhaps argue that many of the problems that the modern day state of Israel have are at least in part related to the fact that their fathers of old did not rid the land of those people. For the inhabitants of the land today, the Palestinians and Arabs that are there are descendants, many of them, from these same people that Israel did not drive out of the land all those years ago. And we see that even in the news today, making headlines. So, chapter 1 ends on a lot lesser note than it began. The book begins with an optimistic outlook that hopefully the children of Israel are going to follow the example of Joshua and the example of the tribe of Judah and rid the land of the Canaanites. But by the time we get to the end of even the first chapter, everything is already fallen apart and is in a downward spiral. We also talked, as we finished chapter 1 last week, about that cycle that we're going to see with the people of Israel throughout the book of Judges. And that cycle is that while they're obedient to God, God blesses them. But as soon as God begins to bless them, it seems like they become a little bit slack, indifferent. And as they begin to become indifferent towards God and lazy, they fall into sin. They fall into idolatry. As they fall into idolatry, of course, God brings judgment upon them, usually in the form of one or another foreign people invading the land, or the people in the land rising up against them. And because of that judgment and the people persecuting Israel, eventually Israel will cry out and admit their sins. They will repent and ask God for deliverance. At that time, God will always send a deliverer for them, and that deliverer throughout this time period is going to be one judge of Israel after another. Hence the name, the book of Judges. These judges will rid Israel of the problem of her enemies for a time. And of course, as they turn back to God, God begins to bless them again. And then the cycle starts all over again. And the book of Judges is that vicious cycle over and over again. And one time after another, we see the rise of a different judge that God provides as part of that cycle to deliver Israel once again, and then they fall into sin again. And so now we begin chapter number 2, verse 1. And an angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt, and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. By the way, does God keep His promises? He does, doesn't He? God always keeps His promises. It's never God that breaks the covenant or breaks a promise. It's always on our part. It's always on our end of the agreement that it gets broken. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? This is God speaking to the people of Israel. He said, I told you not to make alliances with them, drive them out of the land, and I told you all of their places of worship, the groves and their high altars, they were to be torn down, cut down, and you've left them and the people in the land. Why have ye done this? I guess one of the worst feelings in the pit of my stomach on several occasions when I was growing up was to hear my daddy ask me the question, why have you done this? And here is God now asking the children of Israel, why have you done this? Well, I think you and I can remember back to when our parents asked us that question. There's really no good answer for it. We make excuses, but there's not a good answer for it. Verse number 3, wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you. So now this is God speaking, and the very first word of that verse is wherefore. That means because of what I just said. In other words, because of what's in verse 2. Because you didn't drive them out of the land, and because you didn't tear down their altars, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to drive them out for you. You didn't do the work to drive them out when I was helping you, blessing you. So since you're not doing it, I'm not going to do it for you. I think we can all relate to our parents, if they were good parents, telling us pretty much the same thing. If you're not going to do it, I'm not going to do it for you. It'll just lay there undone, and that's what God is saying here. Perhaps there's a spiritual lesson for us, even though we're older perhaps now. There's still a lesson that when God gives us something to do, it's true. We should expect God's blessings and His help if we're doing what He asked us to do. But if we stop doing what we should do, why should we expect God to continue to do His part when we're not keeping our part of the arrangement? And so that's what He said. I'm not going to drive them out for you, and I'm going to leave their false gods there, and they will be a snare to you. Israel did not have to have had the temptation for the next 400 years or so of these false gods in the land. They were tempted because they didn't do what God told them to do in the first place. No one to blame but themselves. Verse number 4, and it came to pass when the angel of the Lord spake these words unto all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voice and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochum, and they sacrificed there unto the Lord. You know, I think perhaps the biggest tragedy in the life of Israel in the book of Judges is that here God told them that He was not going to do the work for them because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. The people knew why God was not blessing them, and yet as we continue on after this, we see that it didn't change their behavior very much. They wept about it, they were brokenhearted about it, but it didn't change their behavior. Now, I know I have been in many services, revival-type services, since I was a boy. Some of them at youth camp when I was a teenager, some of them in revival services in church while I've been an adult. And there have been times that I have seen people go to the altar in tears because they knew that whatever was going on in their life was because of their own sin, and they knew it was wrong, and they were so sorrowful, it seemed, and wept tears of sorrow, only to get up off their knees and go back and do the exact same thing they were doing before. I can remember one time when I was in 7th grade, the Christian school that I attended was a rather large Christian school, and one Wednesday for chapel service, the school administrator allowed the senior class to be in charge of the chapel service. Some of the seniors sang a special or two, and then one of the seniors got up and preached a message in chapel. He's a high school senior. And his message was so direct and to the point that a revival broke out in our little Christian school among the students. And what the service was supposed to have ended somewhere around 10 o'clock that morning. But when lunchtime came around, we were still there in the auditorium, in the church sanctuary where the chapel service was held, because the young fellow that had preached, he had long since stopped preaching, but all over the sanctuary, young people were getting up and going over to other young people and apologizing for things they had done wrong, or going to their teachers and apologizing for the way they had misbehaved and been disrespectful to them. And young people all across the altar at the front weeping and praying because of things that were in their lives at home that shouldn't be there. And young people just for 2 hours making promises to God of things they were going to change in their lives. It was one of the most amazing services I've ever been in. And I was only a 7th grader at the time, so it was quite eye-opening to see all of this happening. I'd never seen God move in the way He was moving. There were some of those young people who made spiritual decisions that day that for the rest of their time in high school, you could tell that they were truly changed. Their life was different, and their relationship with God was obviously different from that point on. But there were other young people that day who got up and gave a testimony of how God had convicted them and how they were going to change this or that or give up this or that. And unfortunately, it wasn't too much time that passed before why they were right back to the same old thing, right back to their old selves again. So some truly made a change and some did not. I think that's what we see here with Israel. They're weeping in sorrow because they know they're wrong. And yet they get up off their knees as a nation, and it doesn't seem that their behavior is going to reflect the tears of sorrow. They cry about it, but don't necessarily do anything about it. And that's what I think we see here with Israel. What a tragedy, and we're going to see this played out throughout the rest of the book of Judges. Verse 6 says, "And when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land." You say, well, I thought Joshua was already dead. This passage here is just before the passing of Joshua, just before his death, and we're doing kind of like they sometimes do in Hollywood movies. We've got the main story, and now we're going back and showing a scene. And the reason I think God takes us back to this scene just before the death of Joshua is because God is showing us what important thing occurred that sets the stage for the rest of the movie, so to speak. That's because Joshua tried to warn them, God tried to warn them, and yet they didn't heed the warning. Look at verse 7. "And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that He did for Israel." Now, you remember Joshua was one of only 2 men that were allowed to see the promised land and enter into the promised land that had been part of that group 40 years earlier, that came up to the river, but lack of faith caused them not to go ahead and cross into the promised land. Joshua was one of the 2 men. Who was the other man that lived? It was Caleb. Now, Moses was... That's right. Moses was still alive, but God didn't allow him to actually go into the land. He saw it afar off with his eye, but he went on. He passed away before they crossed into the promised land. So then the question is, it says not only did they serve the Lord the rest of the days of Joshua, which were not many left, but also the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. Now, we know that these elders that outlived Joshua, they were not some of those children of Israel that had been adults at the time that Joshua and Caleb and the other 10 spies went into the land 40 years before. So these elders of Israel would have been the children that were in Israel when Joshua and Caleb and the spies went into the land and came back and brought the report, and the grown-ups said, no, we can't do it. We're not going. And so they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. Well, these elders would have been the children, the young people who have grown up now. So 40 years tacked on to however old they were at the time.
Well, didn't they have written there, let's see, the first 40 years, right? And then they went to the second 40 years?
No, sir, Brother John. We sometimes, even in my own mind as growing up, I can remember getting that confused and thinking there were two 40-year periods they wandered in the wilderness. When they first left Egypt with Moses, they did stop several places and camp, including the foot of Mount Sinai, but they actually continued on their journey after they left Sinai on up to the edge of the Promised Land. So it wasn't 40 years. It probably took them, 6 months to a year or so to get there. But when they got there, they didn't go into the Promised Land. But it wasn't 40 years before that. It was probably just somewhere between months and a year leading up to that time.
So it's under the impression they went the first 40 years, then God sent them back for another 40.
I can remember thinking the exact same thing, Brother John, but the truth is that it was a very short time before Moses got them up to the Jordan River the first time, but following that was the 40 years. Because the life of Moses, he lived 40 years in Egypt as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Then he lived 40 years with Israel. He lived 40 years on the backside of the desert with his father-in-law Moses, Jethro. And then he lived that last 40 years of his life wandering around with them in the wilderness. So 40, 40, and 40. There wasn't another 40 in there because then Moses would be 160 instead of 120. Does that make sense, the math?
I don't know what the impression kept the first 40 and then went to the second 40.
No, because Moses spent 40 years in Egypt, then 40 years on the backside of the desert with his father-in-law Jethro, and then 40 years leading the children of Israel.
Well, he did spend 40 years in Egypt.
Yes, sir. Growing up as a boy, as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, because he could have been in line to become Pharaoh. And then he spent 40 years on the backside of the desert after killing the Egyptian. So these elders that outlived Joshua, it's because they were children at the time that Joshua went in as a spy into the land. They were younger than him. That's why they outlived him. Verse 8, and Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old. That's a pretty good age, 110. He lived quite a while. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the mount of Ephraim, on the north side of the hill Gaash. And also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. So I want you to think about the fact that when those who had been children, when they came out of Egypt, by the time they had grown up, and now they die after Joshua, there's no one left in the land who actually saw God part the waters of the Red Sea. There's no one left who actually saw him bring water out of the rock. There's no one left who was actually there to see with their own eyes how God brought the flock of fowl into the camp every night and put manna on the ground every morning for them to eat. All of that generation have now died. So the next generation comes on the scene having heard those stories, but never having seen it for themselves. I think that's very similar to the generation of Christianity we have in America today, that at least it's coming along. You know, we hear stories of revivals in days gone by in America, where revival would sweep across the country as the people of God got right with God, and then thousands upon thousands of lost would get saved, saloons would close down, whole communities would change. But the generation we have now, quite honestly, we've never seen that kind of revival in America. We're like this second generation of Israelites who've come out of Egypt. We've heard the stories of the great things God has done in the past in revivals in America, but we've never seen it for ourselves. Israel certainly was in need of a revival, but this generation had never seen it with their own eyes. You say, well, then who's the fault? Who's at fault here? This second generation is going to fall into idolatry. Certainly, a great portion of the blame must be laid on this younger generation of Israelites who choose to adopt the gods, the false gods of the people in the land around them. But some of the fault surely also has to be laid at the feet of the generation that's passing away. Somehow they fell down on the job. Somehow they failed to pass along to that next generation that same zeal for God that had caused them to follow God and even walk across the Red Sea with water piled up on either side of them. They had seen it, and they had done it, and they had experienced God's presence in their lives in a real way and in a personal way. Somehow they had failed to communicate to their children that greatness of God and the need for a relationship with Him. So I think there's some blame perhaps to lay on both generations. But in our own day and time, we ought to be reminded that our children and our grandchildren are dependent upon us to make sure that they not only know how to earn a living when we're gone, but that they know how to have a personal relationship with God when we're gone. It'll be far more beneficial than knowing how to make a dollar. Well, we're going to stop here at the end of verse 10, and we'll resume here next week as we see some more of laying the foundation for what is going to take place for the next 400 or so years in Israel. But I think we're already getting a pretty bleak picture of what the situation looked like. And I think we ought to be reminded that it's not too awfully distant from the situation in which we find America today. I think there are many lessons for America today in the book of Judges. Let's pray. Father, thank you for a chance to study the book of Judges. Help us, I pray, to learn those things that, Lord, the principles you tried to teach to Israel. And help us not just to know them in our heads, but to understand them in our heart, that it would change the way we live and what we do. Lord, help us to be what you want us to be as a people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.